Goes off, folks, or
Yeah.
your camera off if you don't want to be on camera. Okay, so thanks very much for joining, and I do apologize about the glitch with the start. My fault, but let's move on and be positive about the fact that this is going to be really helpful, I hope, to people who are going to see, I would imagine, lots of butterflies in the near future. I was out today and I saw absolute loads of butterflies in a very good site. And it does make a big difference to go to a site which has good conservation work going on, because where there is conservation work going on to improve habitats or maintain habitats, there are loads of butterflies at the minute. But obviously, if you go to somewhere like the middle of a barley field or a playing field that's being mown every week so people can play football on it, you won't see so much. Right. We're talking about late summer, when my very, very grateful thanks to Carla at the Parks Trust, who always managed to stay unflappable and sort everything out. Well done, Carla. What we're doing here, we're going to look through in this order. We're going to look at the nymphalids, that's the colourful butterflies that you get on your buddleia in the garden, and the browns first, then the whites, the blues, including things like the small copper, the skippers, some day flying moths, and hair streaks. Now, I've told you the order because it may be that people will be listening to the recording and they just want to check, for instance, one of the facts about the blues, and they don't want to listen to all the rest of it. So if you know the order in which we're going through it, you might be able to find the bit in the video more quickly. So, as ever, in my opinion, the very best thing you can do is notice, because you can't really help but notice the color of the butterfly and its approximate size. But the first thing that you should be looking for when the butterfly settles, hopefully close to you, is the detail at the wing edges and the margins, the very, very edges. The center of the wing is usually less often of any help. Okay. The ground colour, as I've said here, gives you a clue about the family, but the wing edges are really important. Eyes might help, we'll see with some of the butterflies later. So the location and time of year are definitely helpful, and the fact that males chase each other about, they chase the females about, they'll chase everything about. So anything you see that's deliberately chasing other butterflies, you can assume it's a male, and that helps because the males of some species are different colours to the female. The ones which are more often flying about trying to be inconspicuous and investigating plants, settling on them and tapping their feet against the leaves, those are usually females. Okay, we're into the nymphalids. So a very colourful group, usually very easy to identify. Even when they fly past you, you get quite a good idea, but if they settle, it should be very easy. And I've tried with this slide to show that if you see something fly past and it looks orange, then it's probably small tortoiseshell or comma, possibly painted lady. They can look orange, but sometimes they look pink. A small heath if it's quite a tiny butterfly, or a fritillary if it's very big. If it's much darker, and I don't mean that you're looking at a silhouette because it's way up in the sky against the sun. If it's much darker, then it's either a peacock or a red admiral, or just possibly slightly smaller than the peacock and red admiral, the speckled wood, ringlet, or meadow brown. And I'm not going to spend time on this. We've done lots of sessions now where we've talked about the difference between these butterflies. I think they're all really quite easy to identify. The wing shape alone on the comma should help. The blue lunules around the edge of the small tortoiseshell should help. There's a lot of noise coming in from somewhere. I think someone has their microphone on. If someone is listening and has their mic active, they could switch it off, please. With a painted lady, one of the best clues is the white tips here in the wings, the white dots and spots in the wings. And the peacock, of course, it's the eyes that are the real giveaway. All these previous recordings explaining about the nymphalids in more detail can be found at this website. So if you go to the recording, which is a bit tautologous, isn't it? You can't really go there without this link, but there's the link, upperthamesbutterflies.org, in online events, not just events, but there's events, but this is online events. And you can find all the previous videos that we've recorded. So there'll be, if you want it, there'll be lots of detail about telling the nymphalids apart. The underside of the nymphalids are more difficult, so I'm just very quickly going to go through. Once again, notice with a comma, the wavy outline and the tortoiseshell, the blue lunules. The peacock, the only thing you can really say about it is it's so much less contrasted that the paler band on the outside is pretty much the same tone as the darker band in the middle. So the tortoiseshell look is much more obviously very dark and then paler. The comma is also darker and paler, but the peacock's pretty much uniformly coloured, and especially if you see it in poor light, it just looks uniformly black or uniformly very dark brown. So that's the best way, I think, to tell the peacock from the tortoiseshell, by the difference in the contrast between these two bands. But the wing shape at the edges, wing edges again, folks, does give you the comma. Tortoiseshell slightly pointy on the bits and pieces here, look, but the peacock a bit less so, and slightly bigger, more robust. The speckled wood can look similar, and if you see it settled in a darkish place, then it very likely will look to be pretty dark all over. But one way of telling it from the others is that it isn't as dark, if you can see that detail, but also you've got the fact that these veins make the hind wings seem pleated. Top surface, Red Admiral and Painted Lady, just to point out, they both share the same wing tip look, with white dots in this black tip. Wing tips and wing edges are always very helpful. But the fact that you've got these white dots in the tips tells you, oh, it's either a Red Admiral or a Painted Lady. There's no other species with white dots in a black tip in the UK. And then you can just look to see, is it black with red or this sort of salmony orangey pink colour. The underside is the same. You can still see those white dots in the tip, not quite so obviously black now. And then the undersides of both these are absolutely beautiful. But we're going to move past these because, as I say, I've done all this before in more detail. And we're going to look at two species which are flying at the moment and in fairly good numbers. The silver-washed fritillary is here at the top. This is a male. We can tell very easily that this is a male silver-washed by these dark veins. There are actually scent-bearing scales here. So some of the wing scales are modified and they release scent, which you and I can't detect, but a female fritillary can. So she knows that he's a male. The male dark green doesn't have the same. It does have slightly darker veins. Look here, they are relatively black, but they're nothing like as powerful. And the other thing which you would notice fairly quickly, because you will remember to be looking at wing edges, is the way that this comes to a pointy tip on the silver washed, and notice how it's mostly orange. The black colouring that we see here on the rounded tip of the dark green is absent. So there's no black colouring right at the tip on the silver washed. It's really orange all the way to the tips. The dark green is much darker here, but the dark green refers to the underside actually. So silver washed, very stripy, with these black veins clearly marked on the male. The dark green, far less obvious black on the veins, although the veins are black. But the biggest single clue when you see these fly past and settle is the wing shape, with the very pointy wings of the silver wash normally being clearly obvious, and the more rounded shape of the dark green being quite obvious. But look at the black edges on the dark green fritillary. I mean, they're really prominent, aren't they? These black edges when you look for them, and then you look for them here, and they're just not there. So that's a clear difference. The female of the two, slightly more similar, but again, very pointy wingtips on the female silver washed, and the female dark green, luckily for us, has very pale lunules, these little cells, spots here within the black. Now these can be almost white. They're usually slightly silvery or creamy, but they're very much paler. The silver wash fritillary, the male and the female, is orange all the way to the edges of the wings. So the female is darker towards the wingtips, but she's still got pointy wingtips. The dark green is definitely rounded, very obviously rounded when you see it flying and when it settles. And it's got this clear demarcation really of the edges of the wings being much paler. One further helpful hint is where you see them, because the silver washed, which is quite a stripy butterfly, especially when we see the underside in a moment, is a woodland butterfly. You can see silver wash flying outside woodlands when they leave woodland and move to find a new woodland, because they do move between woodlands, but they spend 90% of their time in the woods. Dark green fritillary, they probably spend 95% of their time in open grassland, and you're very, very unlikely to see the dark green, the grassland fritillary, anywhere except in grassland. Just occasionally, if you go to a wooded area where there's some really wide rides, you might see a dark green fritillary in a very wide ride, but they don't go into relatively enclosed spaces in woodland with anything like the sort of frequency that the silver wash does. So if you're in a fairly dark, narrow ride in a woodland and a fritillary flies past, or if you're actually in the woodland itself, in amongst the trees, and fritillaries fly past, they're silver washed almost for certain. I did make the point when we were looking at the painted lady that although it's a very similar colour and with black marks and dots and things, which might make you think, well, I wonder if that's a fritillary, look at the wingtips. The black and white of the wingtips means you can easily tell that this is a painted lady. The fritillaries have no white in this area. They do have these dots along the edges, but that would be here, wouldn't it? This wingtip, this triangle in the wingtip, helps us see that this is clearly a painted lady. These don't have those white triangular, white dots in a triangular black area at the wingtip, so they're fritillaries. And the reason that the silver washed and the dark green have their names is because of the underside. So the silver washed has these silvery lines that come across here, which some people say make it look as if it's a tide has retreated across a beach and left these little wavelets of water across the wet beach. So these silver stripes, which is why I call it the stripy woodland, the silver wash, the stripy woodland fritillary. And over here we've got the dark green. Once again, we can see much more rounded shape to it, can't we? The dark green with this dark green colour with some brighter green colour too, but clearly dots of white. So here we've got white or silvery stripes, and here we've got white or perhaps silvery, depending on the way the light strikes it, dots. And these two differences, the stripy effect or the dotty effect, these differences are really clear if you see the underside. In a moment, you'll notice that. So for once, I'm saying you don't need to look at the wing edges here. You do need to look towards the middle of the wing. But the shape of the wing itself at the edge may have already told you what you were looking at, but this is confirmation. Stripy woodland, silver washed, dotty grassland, dark green. Okay, we're still in the same family because the nymphalids and the browns are one big family, but we sort of think of the browns as being a bit different, don't we? They're not so colourful for one thing. And as you'll see here, we've got about 5 species to concern ourselves with, possibly 6 if you're in Berkshire. The first of them we already mentioned is the speckled wood. The upper surface, I think, is fairly clearly different to all the other butterflies because it's very dark, dark chocolate, but with these creamy spots and lots of eye spots on the hind wing. Now the ringlet also has eye spots on the hind wing, but not inside creamy, they're almost rectangular blocks, aren't they? The ringlet is a much darker ground colour, and the eye spots have a creamy ring around them, but not a block of cream as the speckled wood does. And of course, on the forewing, there are these blocks of creamy colour with no eye spots. The hind wing, as we said, of the underside helps because of this pleated appearance. The browns which are most numerous at the moment are meadow brown, ringlet and gatekeeper, which we'll come to at the moment. Now the ringlet, as I said, does have lots of eyes on the hind wing, but look, they're just a little ring of creamy colour on a much darker ground colour. Let's look at the speckled wood down here. Can you see these are much bigger blocks of creamy colour? Here they're just rings around the black centre to the eye with its white pupil. The meadow brown has a much more obviously orange appearance to it. Meadow browns, when they get worn, can look very dark, and ringlets, when they get worn, can also look very dark, and the eyes begin to fade. But usually you can see these eyes on the hind wing, even in a fairly faded specimen. And if we see the undersides, the eyes on a ringlet are always visible. But the meadow brown, before we move on from looking at the upper surface, excuse me, you can see a clear difference between the male meadow brown here, which is really quite dark with very small amounts of orange around its eyes on the forewing, and the female meadow brown, which is much paler, isn't she? She's also a fair bit bigger on occasion. Quite often she's sizably, you can notice a size difference. She's much more sizable, much bigger. The orange on the meadow brown is also far clearer in the female. You can find some meadow brown females which have even more orange than the one here in the picture. Sometimes it's just this stripe area here and not this area extending towards the body. Sometimes just the area of the female, but it's always clearly orange with a bit of a band of paler on the hind wing, which isn't anything like so obvious in the males. And I've put in the text at the bottom here about the fact that there is a single white pupil. Now that is normally true, but you can find meadow browns with two tiny white pupils. Unusual. I think it's better to look at the amount of orange colour to help you decide if it's a male or a female, and to decide that it is a meadow brown and not a ringlet, the other dark butterfly with which you could confuse it. If we look at the undersides, as I said, the rings on the ringlet are always really clear, even in very worn specimens, nearly threadbare, just at the end of their life. You can still see these rings on the underside. The meadow brown always has this continuous pale stripe here, which goes right the way from one edge of the wing across to the other, right the way across. That is important. And it's matched by a similar pale band up here in both the male and the female. So you get the idea of a pale stripe across a meadow brown. The small heath, which is about half the size of a meadow brown, but if you only saw one of these two butterflies, you wouldn't know how big the other one was in comparison if you've only got one in front of you. But the small heath, as you can see, looks similar. We've got a bit of a pale area in the forewing and a single eye spot. But the hind wing, this pale mark just here, only comes halfway down the wing. And this pale mark here can be really obvious in the field. When you see a small heath, and they always settle, small heaths always settle with their wings closed. They never bask with their wings open. So you're always looking at it from the underside, and you will see this white mark. It's really very obvious. That's the first thing you should look for. When you look and you see something you think could be a small heath, does it have this approximately half of the wing covered with a very pale mark just there, and the rest of the wing darker? That pale mark stands out so well, better than in this picture in life. Whereas the meadow brown, this pale stripe goes right the way across. The ringlet, of course, no pale stripe. There are some paler markings, but they don't appear to go anywhere much in particular. They're just sort of randomly splodged about on the speckled wood. But it doesn't have anything like the same appearance of orange as the small heath and the meadow brown. It looks uniformly darker than both those, but not as dark as the ringlet. Now there's one more species that you could well see in Berkshire. We're going to come on to the gatekeeper, which all of us are going to be seeing at the moment, I'm sure. But let's look at the grayling first. Down in Berkshire on the sandy heaths, you might see the grayling. This one that I'm holding in my fingers, I'm holding precisely so that you can see the forewing, which is the only one of the browns which has two completely separate eyes. The grayling, like the small heath, only ever settles with its wings closed. You'll never see it with its wings open basking. But it usually settles looking like the picture at the bottom. So this bright orange and cream colour disappears completely. It's really quite surprising. If you do see a grayling, one of the things you'll notice is that you're walking along and usually from the track in front of you, not very far in front of you, up jumps a very large, larger than a meadow brown, a very large and very bright orange butterfly. And you think perhaps, oh, could be a fritillary. It doesn't fly very far, maybe 5 meters, and it settles again on the path. And you creep up to look for this big orange butterfly, and all you manage to do is scare it away because it's folded its colourful wings back inside these drab wings, and it always settles on a path in such a way that it casts no shadow. So it tips its body, depending on the time of day, it tips its body at exactly the right angle, that the sun strikes this edge of the wing at the top here, absolutely directly on there, and there is no shadow underneath. The way we often can see a solid object is by the shadow it throws, and the fact that these are so well camouflaged means that you get really close to them and scare them off again. And you often will chase the grayling, scaring it perhaps 5 times in front of you before eventually you manage to spot precisely where it landed and creep up very slowly and get a good look at it. They're beautiful, beautiful butterflies. It's such a shame that they've become so scarce. They were more widespread, but now they're restricted to the sandy heaths of Berkshire. We've got one more butterfly coming in here, one more brown to talk about, which is the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper looks a bit like a meadow brown and a bit like a small heath. It's, as you can see from the pictures, halfway between the two. So the small heath is about half the size of the meadow brown, and the gatekeeper is intermediate between them. The gatekeeper almost always has 2 white eye spots here, but also it's far more orange. As you can see in the meadow brown, there is a pale stripe and an orange area. In the small heath, there's a lot of orange, but it's darker. This is a much brighter orange over the whole forewing, and even the hind wing looks sort of orangey. And the other thing that you notice with a gatekeeper is that in the small heath, we're looking for a white or pale stripe here that goes from the top edge of the wing to about halfway. Here we've got a little bit that goes down, not halfway by a long way, a small amount of white there, and then a dark area with 2 eye spots in it, and then another area of pale. So it's broken. This pale mark on the gatekeeper is broken in 2. So meadow brown, 1 complete pale stripe. Small heath, half a pale stripe. Gatekeeper, pale stripe broken into 2 parts. There is a potential to confuse this butterfly, which is actually a member of the blue family, despite the fact that it looks orange, with perhaps small heath and gatekeeper. I don't think you'd confuse it with gatekeeper because this is the size of a small heath. Very small, very rapidly flying butterfly. It doesn't fly like a brown, but it is just possible you could confuse it. Let's put the small heath on the same page so we can see. On the top surface, the small copper should pose no problem to you because it's got such a dark hind wing. The small heath, remember, never opens its wings, but if it did, you would see orange all over. Both wings are orange inside, but it's this pale area here which comes about halfway down, which allows us to say, ah, that's a small heath. Look, there's a half a stripe of pale. The small copper looks similar superficially. It's got an orange forewing and a pale brownish grey hind wing, but there's no pale stripe. That half a stripe of pale on the small heath is really crucial at saying it's definitely that species. One more brown species, and that's the marbled white. So the marbled white has this obvious contrast between the black in the male and the white, which is clearly obvious, both upper and underside. The female is slightly more chocolatey brown, slightly more brownish and creamy coloured. There's a bit less contrast, but it's still an obvious pattern that you can hardly mistake, I would think. The only possible confusion I can think is that if you saw a very strongly marked green vein white, the veins on the underside might make you think, could it be a marbled white? But you will notice that on a marbled white, the colour goes across the wing and across the veins. Whereas in the green vein white, all the colour goes along the veins, it follows the veins. So that makes it easy to tell those two apart. Okay, we're getting into the whites, and at this point, I usually pause and say, Carla, can you tell me whether anyone has put any questions in the chat? Not that we actually ask people to do that.
Absolutely not, thanks.
No, but it might have helped if we'd said to people, if you'd like to, you could put questions in the chat. So add them now if you want, folks, but we will do a question session at the end, provided no one asks why did we start late, because that would be embarrassing. Okay, the whites. So let's go on with the whites. I've broken them into two groups because I think this is quite helpful. It's very often impossible to tell which white butterfly just flew past you because they don't stop. But you can usually say it was either extremely small and a bit feeble, in which case it was a wood white, in the spring possibly a female orange tip, or sort of medium size, getting on for the size of something like a small tortoiseshell, which is the green veined white or the small white. But in flight, telling these two apart is almost impossible. A bit bigger, usually, but not always, are the female brimstone, which looks white when it flies past you, and the large white. So you can make some assessment of whether a butterfly that flew past you was one of these smaller four, or a female brimstone, or a large white. And if you can definitely say, well, that's a big white, and I could see the pointy wingtips, then it was a female brimstone. If you can't see pointy wingtips, but you can see black wingtips, then it was a large white. So in flight, you can tell the brimstone from the large white, but the others, I'm sorry, almost impossible to tell them apart. Now we're going to look at the two yellow butterflies that you could well see at the moment. A few lucky people are seeing clouded yellows at the moment. Their numbers are going to rise for certain this summer. It's exactly the sort of weather that suits clouded yellows. They fly in from abroad and they do very well when the weather's warm. So anyway, yellow brimstone, very pointy wingtips. Clouded yellow, rounded, slightly pointy, I agree, but nothing like this with these pointy tips. Extra extensions from the wing. And you'll have noticed that the clouded yellow has a white centre to the orange mark here, whereas the brimstone usually doesn't. It's usually entirely dark. But when they fly past you, these two are quite easily told apart by the brimstone being a sort of lemony yellow colour and the clouded yellow being much darker, like an egg yolk colour or custard colour. We're going to go on to the white ones. These are the ones that cause the most trouble, I think, to most people because we see lots of them and they are difficult if they only fly past you. If they settle, they're quite easy. If they don't settle, they're quite hard. Luckily for us, the small white has a small amount of grey at the wingtips. The large white has a large amount, and it's as if someone had turned up the volume or the saturation, because it's got not only a large amount of scaling on the wingtips, but it's very dark. So small white, small amount of relatively grey, large white, large amounts of relatively black. So that makes them easy to tell apart, and thankfully it's the right way round. We get a large L of black on the large white and a small smudge of grey in the small white. The green veined white, which I've now popped on the screen between the two, I hope you can see there's a sort of a case to be made that it's between these two, because we get far more black on the green vein white here that I've just put up, far more black than on the small white. Look, it comes way down the wing, much further. But it isn't a solid mass of black as in the large white. It's separate little triangles or chevrons, which are each one of them on a wing vein. So you follow the wing vein out, and there's the black triangle around the vein. And these come down to below what's called the cell spot. So this here is the cell spot. That's the cell spot. This spot here is the cell spot. So the green vein white, these triangles come down to the vein just below the cell spot. And the black mark on a large white also comes down to just below the cell spot, but here they're continuous. That one looks to be slightly broken apart, but overall it's obvious that they form a big single mark. Oh, I beg your pardon. Whereas with the green vein white, you can see that they are separate little triangles. So they should be easy if they sit still for a moment in front of you. Now, it's worth pointing out that the male and the female of the white species do look slightly different. These are both small whites, so a grey smudge, small amount of not very black scales. Sometimes you'll see a female small white which does have quite black tips, but never coming very far down the wing, never as far as the cell spot here, never down to there. Towards it, I agree, but not down to there. And the male of all the white species has a single black dot here. The female has a black dot there, and then one or more dots here, apart from the orange tip. The female orange tip, annoyingly, has just one black dot, just to break the rule. But all the others, the male, the single dot, and the female, two or more. So if we look at a female brimstone, when it's flying, it looks even less like this greenish color you see here in the picture. It looks much, much whiter, but you can, if you're lucky, see these really pointy tips, just like on the male. The green veined white female, far more black, several dots as suggested, but again, look, separate triangles coming in along the veins. Quite often at this time of year, the green vein whites are better marked than they were in the spring, so that these marks are slightly darker in the summer broods. It varies quite a lot. The further north you go in Britain, the darker these marks are. And there is speculation that by having darker wings, it helps them absorb heat from the sun more easily. But I wonder whether people are suggesting that because it sounds sensible rather than because it's a fact. That's the reason for it. But they are darker if you go north. So we're looking at the undersides now, and we see that once again, luckily, there are some fairly clear differences. The small white has the fewest of these grey scales, and they're almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them in the lower half of the hind wing. Very few up here on the wingtip. The green veined white has a few more on the tip of the forewing, but then plenty of grey scales following the veins on the hind wing. And the large white, luckily for us, because it fits with my theory that the large white was the one with the most black about it, has the largest number of scales, and they are all over both the wingtips, which look very dark, and the whole of the hind wing. It is covered with grey scales almost equally above and below this centre vein here. So small white, least grey scales, only really in the bottom half of the wing. Green vein white, quite a lot of grey scales, but only along the veins. Large white, lots of grey scales, and they're everywhere, apart from this white area here. There's a few, but there's very few in the white area. So The more grey scales you can see, the more likely it is to be a large white. The wood white I left separately. You will see it in North Bucks. It is still flying at the moment, and in fact should become a bit more common, a little bit easier to find in August. It has an extremely fluttery flight, but what you'll notice about it, it does have grey scales, but look how they go across the veins. So we talked about the marbled white with the marks going across the veins. This is similar. Green veined white, the scales go along the veins. Here they go across. And the wood white has this big blob of black at the wingtips. Wood whites will, when they're courting, hold their wings open. They don't normally sit with their wings open, but they will open their wings when they're courting. And this large blob of black, quite different in shape and position to that of the other whites, is really clear at that time. Here's a green vein white for comparison. It's the one that most people are likely confused with wood white, because green vein whites and wood whites are more likely to be seen in woodland. You can get small and large white in woodland, but green vein whites prefer woodland to open areas. Green vein white with the dark colour along the veins, and the wood white with the colour, the grey scales, across the veins. Okay, we're on to the blues. I'll just stop briefly. At the very least, it gives people time to take a breath and ask Carla, were there any questions?
Yes, we did have one comment, really, a question to say, is the marble white related to the browns? Which, of course, I answered yes. Would you like to expand on that, please?
There's not a lot of expanding to do. You're absolutely right. The marbled white, bizarrely, although it looks more like one of the white butterflies, is a brown family member. The genes, the genetics tell us that it is a brown butterfly, but we think, seeing as you've asked the question, I'll tell you that it's deliberately chosen to make itself strikingly coloured because the caterpillars eat a type of rust, which is a fungus that grows in the grass that the caterpillars eat. They eat that on purpose, we think, and they take it into their bodies, and it makes them extremely distasteful to birds. And we think the butterfly has benefited from gradually changing from being a very dark butterfly like a meadow brown or a ringlet to something with that striking black and white colouring, because it's a way of saying to birds, you ate one of these once before and you didn't like it, if you remember. So leave it alone, because this is another of those distasteful butterflies. So we think that explains why it's a brown butterfly that looks more like a white, because the cabbage whites, as you perhaps know, they contain chemicals from cabbages which make them distasteful to birds, which is why we hardly ever see spotted flycatchers anymore in this part of the UK. But if you were watching spotted flycatchers catching butterflies around buddleia bushes, those of you as old as me might remember watching that. They very rarely take the whites. They don't like the flavour. And we think that partly explains why the marbled white, which is a brown butterfly and shows a clear lineage back to the other brown butterflies, looks more like a white butterfly. It's for protection. Okay.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Nick.
You're welcome. Let's look at the blues. Now, some people really struggle here. I think, to be honest, if you get a little bit of practice, these are easier than the whites, because one of the good things about the blue butterflies is that they are extremely well mannered. The blue butterflies, with the possible exception of the purple hair streak, but we'll draw a veil over that, they will settle close to you after you've scared them. So you walk towards them, maybe without seeing them, and they fly up. They tend to stop fairly quickly and sit in full prominent view so that you can easily see what they are. The white butterflies are incredibly ill-mannered, and you'll scare a white butterfly up, or it will fly towards you from behind you, wherever, and it will keep going for the next 2 miles, and you will lose sight of it, and you'll never know what it was. But the blues are extremely polite and helpful, and they will always stop, usually right on top of a flower or a piece of vegetation in full view, and you can creep up carefully, slowly and cautiously, and you can get a good look. So the blues shouldn't be anything like the problem the whites are, because they're so much better behaved. If they do just fly past, I don't think they do very often, but try and get an idea about the blue. If it is an absolutely brilliant electric blue, then it could have been an Adonis. If it seems quite a pale blue, it's probably a holly blue. And if it looks a slightly purpley shade of blue, it's a common blue. But if you only see one of these three fly past, then it's difficult to compare because we all have trouble remembering quite what shades of blue look like. The small blue and the brown Argus, two other butterflies you'll see flying with these, look quite silvery, almost greeny silvery, and they do look very, very dark when they settle. So these brown coloured blue butterflies, so just like in the brown butterflies we had the white, marbled white, in the blue butterflies we've got some brown coloured butterflies. They don't help, do they? Or the person who gave them their names wasn't thinking very clearly. Anyway, there are some blue butterflies that look brown, and I would say that you can usually make a pretty good guess at which species, and you will know that if it looked silvery green with a brown upper surface, then it's probably a brown Argus. Both the male and the female, they have a sort of a silvery green tint to them as they fly past, but you can see that they're not blue, they are brown. If they look silvery brown or an extremely dark blue, like a navy blue, then they're probably either the female common blue, the female Adonis, and it should say just there, or chalk-hill blue, but I can't think why that's disappeared off. I think it probably didn't fit properly on the slide and it's managed to disappear, and I hadn't spotted that till now. So female common blue, female Adonis or chalk-hill blue, or if it's really tiny, a small blue. So as I've written here, male and female small blue and the brown Argus are much smaller than the common blue, usually. Okay, now I developed this key. It's a bit complicated. I don't think I'm going to go through it in a lot of detail with you now, but if you watch the recording, I think this is a very helpful thing. It makes sense to me, but that's because I developed it. If you wanted to, of course, you could copy this. You've my permission to do so, and you could change it to make it work for you. But I think the best thing you can do, if you see a blue butterfly, the first thing you say to yourself, oh, is that a really bright blue? Or is it mostly a brown, very dark blue? And if it's one of the very brown dark ones, then you know it was either a brown Argus, a small blue, or one of the brown females of the three other species we just mentioned. So that narrows it down. That's 5 species. If it's one of these very dark brown coloured things and it's very small and there are no red lunules on any surface, then it's a small blue. But if it is small and dark, but it does have bright red lunules with black veins going through the white borders, then it's a brown Argus. If you can't see the black veins through the white border, it could be some of these other females. So if you see something that's small and brown, you can tell it's a blue butterfly because of its general behavior, its sort of obvious color and size, but it doesn't look blue, then it's probably a brown Argus, a small blue, or one of those 3 female of the blue butterflies, but they are the brown coloured females. If it's very small with no red, small blue, but if it's got obvious bright red, then it's probably a brown Argus. These common blue female, Adonis blue female, and chalk-hill blue female, I've missed it off here as well. I don't know what's gone wrong there. Sorry about that. But anyway, these are bigger. They are brown. They might have some blue scales near the body, but they're brown butterflies, but they're bigger than the brown Argus. Oops, sorry. And then coming to the bottom of the page, if, in contrast, we've seen a butterfly that was obviously blue, there's no question it isn't just a bit bluish, it's blue. If, once again, if you can see no red lunules, If it settles and there's no hint of red anywhere, then it's a holly blue. So the really tiny dark ones with no red are small blue. The bigger ones, which are blue with no red, are holly blue. But then the other lot here, that's more complicated. So all the other blues are a bit more complicated. Let's look at the pictures. So first of all, I decided to start with the two very dark members of the blue family, but which are not actually blue in my opinion. So the brown Argus here with its really obvious red lunules, and black marks where the veins go through the white margin to the wing, and the small blue. No obvious red lunules, in fact no hint of a red lunule, nothing red about it at all. So these two dark butterflies can be easily told apart because the small blue, which is usually even smaller than the brown Argus, but the brown Argus can be very small, there's no hint of red. It's just silvery on one surface with black, white ringed eye spots and a very, very dark slaty navy blue on the top. The brown Argus is more chocolate blue, but it's got really obvious red lunules on both surfaces. The holly blue and the small blue look similar on their undersides, but you will notice that the small blue, as I said, is silvery with black eye spots which have white rings around them, and the holly blue is white with black streaks that are not ringed with another colour. These are streaks, aren't they? They're not spots. So the holly blue has these sort of dashes on a white background. But the most obvious thing about a holly blue, if you see one, is that it is blue. Both the male and the female holly blue are blue. In fact, it's the only blue in this part of the world. The large blue would count, but we don't get them around here. It's the only species in this part of the world which is blue, whether it's a male or a female, but no red lunules. So both these lack red lunules, but I think they can be told apart quite easily. This is obviously blue, white with black dashes. This is not obviously blue, although it looks bluish, and it's got circular black dots, white rings on a silvery background, neither with red lunules. There is one moth that you might conceivably mix up with the small blue. And it's called a chimney sweeper. It's a day-flying moth. It's around at the moment. Its brood is just about finishing, but there are still some about. So watch out that you do look carefully if you see something really dark like this, that you don't think to yourself, oh, that's definitely a small blue. Look how dark it is and how small it is, because this is a day-flying moth, but it does have these strikingly white wingtips. And the small blue, of course, doesn't have white wingtips. Okay. Probably of all the blues, the two that people struggle with most to tell apart clearly are the female common blue and the brown Argus, male and female. Male and female brown Argus look identical like this. So the female common blue, you should always be able to see some hints of blue, even if it's only a few blue scales on the body. But you will also see, and this I shall repeat endlessly this evening, I guess I always do, has extremely clear borders. They are pure white, right the way around. There is never a hint of any black vein through the border. And these lunules, as they're called, are orange, not red. Brown Argus, bright red. The lunules go right to the top of the wing look, whereas here they don't usually go quite so far. And there are always black veins just protruding into the white margin. So it should be quite simple to tell the female common blue from a brown Argus. This just looks so much smarter and contrasty as well. This isn't a picture that's been badly developed or over pixelated or something. Common blues just don't look as sharp and smart as a brown Argus. This little fella is a female silver-studded blue, and you might say, well, she looks a bit like the brown Argus we just saw, but no, I would argue it doesn't. Once again, it's orange lunules, not red. They're not separate. They're sort of almost a smear of orange here. But we've also got these round black arcs coming in here, rounded arcs. Can you have a rounded arc? Well, if you can, those are they. So this is a silver-studded blue, and these are restricted to the heaths in East Berkshire in our region. But they do look superficially similar to the common blue, don't they? But look down here where you've got these black arcs around the hind wing of the silver-studded, and we've got all these pale marks on the hind wing of the common. But I would have to agree with anyone who's saying he hasn't mentioned the clear border. Both of them have a clear border. There is a hint of a black vein here, isn't there? But by and large, when you look at a silver-studded blue, you get the impression that it's got a clear white border, just like the clear white border to a common blue. So you have to look just slightly inside the very edge of the wing at the lunules here on the hind wing, where there is always some pale colour on the common blue, but there is always black on the silver-studded. Here we're looking at the undersides of common blue and brown Argus, and once again I'm going to draw your attention to these looking rather orange. In fact, in many common blues these are so pale they hardly show up at all, but if it's a well-marked individual, these are orange. These look a bit redder, but not as red as in the brown Argus. But luckily we don't have to use our subjective ability at judging how orange something is. We can look at the actual marks, because there is always, on a common blue, there is always a dot just there. And I would say that the dots around inside the wing here always form a relatively smooth arc. Do you see where I've linked them up? If you try and look on the same position on the brown Argus, these are all over the place, look. They're not in a smooth arc. There's a sort of a question mark and then another spot. In fact, these two are often referred to as the figure of 8. And where we had the dot on the common blue, there's an empty space. Look, there's no dot there. And of course, the brown Argus, as we know, has black veins going through the white margin, whereas the common blue has a clear border. I can hear you all shouting it. So they're really quite simple. The undersides are very easy to tell apart, provided you get a clear view. And as I said, these are well-behaved butterflies. If you're cautious in your approach, you can get a good look. If you wear close focus binoculars and use them, easy to see the difference between these two. The difference, by the way, if anyone's wondering, this one looks quite silvery and this one quite brown. That's because this brown Argus, male and female, do look very silvery. This is a female common blue. The males look much paler. I wouldn't say silvery, I'd say pale brown, but they do look more like the ground colour of a male common blue is more like the ground colour of a brown Argus, but the male common blue doesn't have the orange lunules here anything like as strongly, so you'd immediately say, well, there's no red lunules, that's not a brown Argus. The female common blue and the female Adonis and Chalk-Hill blue look similar. I'm afraid there's no two ways about it. They're hard to tell apart. If you're able to get close enough and you can see a clear border with no black veins, common blue. If there are black veins, then it's either Adonis blue or Chalk-Hill. So there's checkered borders, and also on the Adonis blue, can you see that there are blue, really quite clear blue lunules here inside the red and black? That's fairly important because the Chalk-Hill blue looks just like the Adonis blue. except it doesn't have blue there. Telling the female Adonis from the female Chalkhill is very, very difficult in a worn specimen. But we can tell the female Adonis and the female Chalkhill from the common because the common blue has clear borders. Okay, common blue and Adonis blue male. So there are at least three things here that will help us. One is the striking colour of the Adonis. Absolutely incredible. They are also slightly larger than a common blue, but it is very slight. And then we've got the borders. And what the common blue have? They have, thank you for chorusing it. I heard you all thinking it in your heads, if not shouting it out. Clear borders. And the Adonis blue, a checkered margin, black veins in the borders. So if you see a very bright blue butterfly and think to yourself, could that be an Adonis blue? That's very bright. Then the first thing you do is you remember, well, common blues have clear borders. Let's look at the borders, the wing edges. And if you can see these black veins, then it is definitely not a common blue, but an Adonis. Well done, a rare butterfly. The undersides, we get the same difference, really, the difference in the wing veins coming through the border. So looking at these two, which one is the common blue, folks? Common blue with a clear border, remember, and Adonis with a checkered border. I hope you all got that the right way around. The Adonis with a checkered border, and the common blue with a clear border. Silver-studded male and male common blue. Unfortunately, they've both got clear borders, but the silver-studded blue is smaller than the common blue. And look, we've just like the female silver-studded blue, we've got these little black marks on the hind wing, where there is nothing similar or nothing remotely as marked in the common blue. But these two can be a bit tricky. Sometimes you can see a particularly small male common blue and it looks a bit like a silver-studded, but if you see both together, they're obviously different. The silver-studded blue is slightly smaller. It's got a broader black margin inside the white margin. So the black border inside is thicker, wider. And we've got these black marks on the hind wing. I've referred to them there as small black triangles. Yeah, okay, I think they probably are. And the females' undersides, you should be able to see these little blue marks here. Sometimes this particular part of the wing just here has those same blue scales, and so do these. It depends on the individual. It's a slightly variable thing, but I think you might be able to guess, now that I've pointed these to your attention, which of these is the one that's referred to as silver-studded. And I'm hoping you're going to tell me you think this butterfly at the top left is the silver-studded, and the common blue is over here. The common blue is greener near the body, look. And the SSB, the silver-studded blue, has these blue studs. I'm not quite sure why it's called silver-studded because they definitely do look blue. Anyway. And as I've said, the black is much more defined. Much more defined. Just in the same way that this black margin was broader on the top surface, it's broader, clearer on the undersurface as well. And up here, look, all the eye spots are bigger. There's more black. Strongly contrasted. This by contrast, sorry, that's a bad way of expressing my sentence. Here we have a strong contrast with large black spots and white circles around them. Here, some of them are clearly contrasted, but there is a difference because it isn't quite so obvious. This isn't quite as sharply defined in the difference between the ground colour and these larger black dots. These are slightly more subdued. But the best thing to look for on the underside is definitely these silver studs, which are present on the male and the female silver studded blue. So if you've been listening, and I'm sure you have, despite the fact I've been whittering on for a long time, over an hour now, I'm afraid. But anyway, if you've been listening, you'll have no fear about deciding which species we're looking at here, because you will notice that here we've got black veins going through the margin. And this butterfly, when it closed its wings, this is the same butterfly. You'll have noticed this one doesn't appear to have any red anywhere. This one does have clear margins, but it has got some red. Doesn't seem to have any of those silvery studs, does it? So what do you think we've got here? Did we get holly blue? I hope we did. And common blue? I hope we did. So these are the two which are most common in our gardens. Holly blue usually earlier in the year and later. Common blue is around in gardens at the minute, and as is the holly blue. Another way of telling these two apart is by behaviour. Common blue very often is seen flying around the flowers and low down in the grass, settling on the ground. The holly blue is normally seen flying around the bushes and settling higher up above your head. So holly blue is a species which breeds in bushes and trees, and it doesn't bother coming down to the ground very often, but in very dry weather like we have at the minute, it might come down looking for moisture. But generally speaking, the holly blue lives higher. The common blue tends to fly around the vegetation much lower down, about knee height, perhaps waist height if the vegetation is very long. Okay, we've finished with the blues, you'll be pleased to hear, which means we've got relatively simple going from here on. We've got rid of the worst ones, the whites and the blues. Are there any questions, please, Carla?
Sorry, I was just extending the meeting time because it's telling me I had 5 minutes.
I beg your pardon.
I think somebody's just typing. No questions up to this point.
Okay, well, because we are overrunning, I shall crack on. I've mentioned that there are two spring species, and the dingy, which is a spring species, can appear again in the summer, but most of the skippers we see in the summer are orange. Let's get into them straight away. So in the spring, we see the grizzled skipper, this very dark chocolate and white checkered butterfly, but almost never does anyone see one later in the year. There's been maybe 5 records in the Upper Thames branch in the whole of the time that the Upper Thames branch has existed of a grizzled skipper late in the year. So I can't say it won't ever happen, but they don't often. Whereas dingy skippers, I would be amazed if we don't get 30 or 40 sightings of this in August. It is very likely that people will be telling us they're seeing dingy skippers this August for 2 reasons. One, when the weather is very warm, which it has been, it triggers the dingy skipper to have a second brood. And 2, the number of dingy skippers this spring was high compared with recent years. So there are more of the caterpillars about to develop very rapidly and fly in the summer, lay eggs, we hope, which will turn into butterflies late next spring. But most dingy skippers lay their eggs, which turn into caterpillars, which go on to pupate, go through the winter as pupa and hatch in the spring. But there will be dingy skipper, so look out for this fairly drab but quite an active and rather attractive through its behaviour butterfly. Zips about very low to the ground, can be difficult to follow its flight, but luckily, a bit like the blues, it's not quite so well behaved as the blues because it tends to zip away at great speed and it can go quite a distance. But if it's a male butterfly you're looking at, the dingy skipper male will tend to come back to the same place where you scared it in the first position. It'll come back somewhere close by and settle, often on bare ground, because they do like dingy skippers to settle on the ground. Okay, but let's get into the summer skippers, because you'll all have been seeing plenty of these and there'll still be lots about, I should think, for another couple of weeks at least. So large skipper, which has got these darker wing tips, so that the orange ground colour can be seen to sort of bleed into it with a few spots of the orange showing through. And on the hind wing, a slightly greenish hue to the hind wing with some creamy spots showing through. And then the small and the Essex skipper, which look incredibly similar, a much more orange colour to the upper surface. And even on the undersurface, where it isn't quite so obviously orange, it has a sort of a sandy grey, not the greenish hue of the large. And the large has these pale spots. So if we see the upper surface, we're looking to see, does the wing margin, the wing edge, have a dark margin? And if we're looking at the hind wing, we're looking to see, are there any spots? Now, they're not really very clear on the large skipper, but they are there if you get a good look. And they are definitely not there on the small or the Essex. Here we're looking at the undersides in fairly clear view, and this one is an Essex skipper. And I hope you can see, I'll just go back to the small skipper. Notice how it looks sort of greyish. The Essex skipper looks much more uniformly orange, doesn't it? But anyway, the point is the Essex skipper and the small skipper, there is no hint of a spot of any sort. There's no spot of creamy colour or black colour or any colour. But the large skipper definitely does have these spots. And as I've said, size isn't awfully helpful. If you only see one, then you wouldn't really know whether it was a large or an Essex or a small, because the size isn't awfully helpful. And this is very important, people, both have black tips to the antenna. So you will probably know, because people will have told you in the past, even I will have told you in the past, you can detect Essex skipper because they have black tips to their antenna. So do the large skipper. Beware. You can tell the Essex skipper from the small by the antenna, but you can't tell Essex skipper from large by the antenna. Another way of telling the small and the Essex skippers apart is by what's called the scent mark. We spoke about the scent scales on the vanes of a silver washed fritillary. Here we've got the same sort of thing, look. This slightly sinuous and long scent mark on a small skipper, and a straight short mark on the Essex. Now these are only in the males. The females will not have that. They're just plain orange. So it doesn't help. But if you see a male, then it is very helpful, because you can look, you can either see this longish mark and say to yourself, oh, it's a small skipper. It's got a long sinuous scent mark, or a very short straight mark, which often is hardly visible. Oh, it's an Essex skipper. But of course, the way that most people tell these apart is by looking at the antenna. And the small skipper has an orange tip. Very often, the whole of the stem here is quite dark. And it can be that if you're looking from on top, the tip looks black. But if you look from underneath slightly, this very tipmost part and the underside here is orange or brown. And the whole of the stem is quite dark. Whereas if we look at an Essex skipper, most of the stem is very pale, and then there is a sudden change to an incredibly dark tip, which is both on the top and underneath, but you need to see the underneath. So a distinct, very contrasty black tip, contrasting very strongly and suddenly with a change to a pale stem, Essex. The colour of the antennal stem here can be quite varied. Often it's pale, but gradually gets darker. Sometimes it's entirely dark. But the very tip of the small skipper's antenna is usually orange, or if it's darker than that, it's the same colour as the rest of the stem. There isn't the same immediate and sudden abrupt change. And I've put here, because you read this in all the books, I think, that it looks like it's been dipped into wet ink. It's absolutely true. Both these butterflies, by the way, I put it at the very bottom there, have rounded tips. They're blunt. But the large skipper, which, like the Essex skipper, has black tips when you look at them, it's got these little twirly, twiddly extra details added on with an extra pointy bit sticking out the end of the antenna. But we would not confuse ourselves with this being Essex, would we? Because we'd notice that there's a darker margin to the wing. Now, here is a confusion that can be tricky. Sometimes large skippers, these pale marks here in the darker margin and the pale spots on the underside can be really quite strongly marked and very obviously much paler than in this more typical specimen. But the silver spotted skipper, the contrast is much more obvious, and especially on the hind wings underside, where not only have you got these rings, these pale marks here, rather like this, but this area here on the large skipper, there is never a strong contrast. There is always a very strong contrast with these two spots here on a silver spotted. So one of the things you would notice, as I've said here, is the behavior. The large skipper are butterflies that fly about and settle on things like knapweed and thistles and so on. The ones which are on big stems, so like creeping thistle, possibly the nodding thistles. On things like the greater knapweeds and the black knapweeds, they might go to ragwort. We're talking about flowers which are growing to waist height, even higher perhaps. And the large skippers will settle on bushes, on the brambles and the blackthorn and the buckthorn and all the other bushes around a flowery area. The silver spotted skipper will almost always be found really close to the ground. They will come up to flowers sometimes, as this one has to a scabious, but if they go to a thistle, it's usually a ground thistle, sometimes called picnic thistles. They're very rarely flying any height above the ground. And when you do see them fly about, they look really stocky. You get the impression of them being much more robust than a large skipper. I don't think they are actually, but it's just the way they seem. They've got a very whirring flight. The large skipper has a fairly energetic flight, but the silver spotted skipper outdoes it for looking like it's on some sort of speed and it's going mad, zipping about really quickly. Doesn't go very far necessarily, and it doesn't fly very high, but it does everything at super speed, and it zips back and lands pretty close to where it set off from most of the time. But just watch out, as I say, make sure you can see these spots before you claim silver spotted skipper, because just occasionally the spots here in the outer arc of a large skipper can be much paler than in this typical specimen. And the females that fly latest of the large skipper tend to be the ones with the palest marks here. And of course, it's the silver spotted skipper that flies latest of all. So people see a very late large skipper with pale spots and think, oh, it must be a silver spotted because the large skippers are coming to the end. But make sure you can see these spots nearest to the body before you claim silver spotted. Okay, we're not going to spend a long time on day flying moths, you'll be pleased to hear, because there are, as you probably know, hundreds. I'm not joking. And it would take a very long time. We've been long enough on a few butterflies. So I'm just basically mentioning that there are lots about. You can confuse them with butterflies, but even more to the point, in my opinion, you should be trying to identify them, enjoy them. They're just as relevant to us as the butterflies, or they should be. For some reason, many people say, oh, that's a day flying moth, and walk straight past. Please don't. They're equally beautiful and wonderful, and it's worth having a look. Some of them are extremely good, and they sit still forever. So things like the burnet moths, here we've got the 6 spot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spots on that wing and 6 on this one. And here a 5 spot look. They tend to sit very still, very obliging. The cinnabar isn't quite so helpful, and most of these others are definitely not. Because the trouble with moths and trying to identify them is that they tend to be scared out of the grass as you walk towards them and before you spotted that they were there, and they fly away from you, and about 3 to 5 meters from you, they dive back into the grass and disappear because they deliberately bury themselves in the vegetation. The species that don't are occasionally the silver white, especially at dusk when they will come and feed from flowers. The hummingbird hawk moth, which obviously flies in the day and is really obvious as it hovers in front of flowers, and the scarlet and Jersey tiger. The Jersey tiger looks very much like the scarlet, but it has stripes instead of spots. They will all quite deliberately sit in the open on occasion, but most of the others try and hide away. So please do enjoy your day flying moths. They're as worthy of study as the butterflies, but I appreciate if you're only just learning your butterflies, the prospect of tackling 2,500 moths as well does seem a bit daunting. When you've got the butterflies licked, start the moths, or begin the moths as soon as you've got the common butterflies licked. And we're on to our last group, folks. Well done. Anyone who's stayed with it has done very well. As I've said here, hair streaks, they're not particularly difficult to tell apart in some respects, but the problem is actually getting a look at them in the first place, because blooming things live at the tops of trees and they just don't want to come down to help you out. They're not at all interested in whether you can see them or not. They're only interested in finding each other, mating and laying eggs. And that all happens at the tops of trees or the tops of bushes, which means it can be a real pain trying to spot them. And then once you've spotted one, working out what it is because it's so far from you up against the sky. However, let's have a look at them. So at the moment we have flying the white letter hair streak, which, as I've said, has a solid black submarginal line just here. So there's a red area, submarginal, and then a line just inside it, which is solid black all the way. Now I mention that because although it's too late now for you to see a black hair streak, the black hair streak looks really similar, but this black line, if we were looking at a black hair streak, would be a series of black blobs. So it isn't a single continuous line. This white W here is what gives the white letter its name, but it's not always clear. And I thought my red line here was going to turn to show us that there is a white line similarly on the purple, but I'd forgotten it actually says look for the eye spot on the purple. So this butterfly is pretty clearly grey or silver, depending on how optimistic and charming you want to be about the butterfly. If you feel a bit dull that day and you don't feel like giving praise where it isn't really due, you might say it looks rather grey. But if you're feeling particularly that you want to be considerate and helpful to the butterfly's prospects, you might describe that as looking silvery. They do look silvery as they fly. And purple hair streaks are one of the few hair streaks that will settle with their wings open to bask in the sun, and then you can catch this purple iridescence. So you can see that, but you have to be very lucky. They don't often come down to the ground. They're normally at the top of oak trees. The white letter is normally at the top of elm. I thought there was a red line pointing at the W, but anyway, never mind. Now the brown hair streak is also flying at the moment. This is a scarcer species than the other two in the UK as a whole. In our area, the brown hair streak is perhaps about as common as the white letter because the white letter's restricted to feeding on elm, and there aren't all that many elm trees left, not big ones, and the hair streaks prefer bigger trees. The brown hair streak is quite widespread. It's crept into southeast Berkshire, and it's also found from just west of and south of Oxford right the way through to Bicester, in a big area there, a large area of Oxfordshire and northern Bucks. So Brown Hare Street covers quite a wide area, and it is also a hare street that settles with its wings open look. The male relatively bland, just a hint of orange, but the female unusually being much brighter coloured than the male and quite striking with these orange patches. Both the male and the female look like this when they close their wings. I would say that was a beautiful butterfly, and the brown hair streak is bigger than the other hair streaks. So I've put it here for a comparison with a gatekeeper. But if you are not used to seeing brown hair streaks, the first time you see one, you might well think that it's a gatekeeper. They are a very similar tone and colour, and they fly about the edge of a hedge, both of them. And the brown hair streak, when it settles, you will immediately notice these white stripes. Well, I say you'll immediately notice, assuming it's in a position where you can see them, you will see that these white stripes stand out, and it's evidently a hair streak. These little tails at the back, as you can see on these nice fresh specimens, get broken off fairly quickly. Within a day or so, they've gone. But the rest of the butterfly is fairly obviously quite a different beast from the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper, you remember, has got these two areas of pale broken by a darker area, but here we've got two separate, really clearly white lines. Brown hair streaks breed in blackthorn, so you can find them really low down because the females like to lay anywhere from ankle height to about head height in blackthorn. So the females you'll find relatively easily down at a level where you can watch them. But the males tend to spend their time at the top of ash trees. We believe that they feed on aphid dew up there. But that's the brown hair streak, a really lovely butterfly, and one that when you see it will give you pleasure because they are beautiful. A really lovely, lovely butterfly. And that's the end of how to tell your butterflies apart. I'm just going to plug recording what you see. Please, we really do want people recording things because that way we know what's going on. This year is a very peculiar year with its strange weather. Some butterflies appear to be responding very well. Common blues seem to be doing very well at the moment after a dreadful start. Gatekeepers doing very well at the moment. What else will do well? Will we get lots of butterflies in the autumn or even in August, which isn't all that far away? So please record what you see. This is a free app, but if you don't like using phone apps, you can do it on your PC by using the butterflies for the new millennium, which is available through the Butterfly Conservation website. Or if you're out recording and you do like using your phone app, or if you're on your PC and you like recording everything you see, iRecord is the place to put your records of everything. I would say it was better than iNaturalist, but I know some people prefer that. It is an alternative. The butterfly conservation view is that we should all try and use iRecord and use the same system because it makes it so much easier when we want to look at the results later if we haven't got bits of data lost in different systems. So they're pushing that everyone uses iRecord so that we don't get competing systems with bits of data being lost all over the place in lots of different apps. Submitting your records when you've collected them, there is a talk, a video recorded, and one where we did start on time, I think. But anyway, that there is at least one about how to go out surveying and another one somewhere about, can't see it there, but in the list, if you look through this list of online events, you'll find where you can record stuff, how to do it. If you're struggling with that, there's some information on one of those. But the various apps and so on have helps anyway. They've all got pages of help. So thank you very much. At this point, I'll take any questions you might have. Oh, there's the bit I was talking about, just popped up. Okay, so any questions, please? Let's take them now. And once again, I'll just apologise once more. I'm sorry we started late. It was really frustrating that I couldn't log in to my own talk, but I just couldn't for some reason.